This is a snoozer of a headline, and yet it has some of the most interesting data I've seen in a long time, especially when viewed through the lens of our incredibly polarizing politics. But the conclusion has a ray of hope for unity in the future, so let's dive into it. So the data is really summarized here in this chart. Now this data is coming from anonymized census and tax data, and it's looking at low-income parents, defined as the bottom 25% income earners, from 1978 to 1992, and then it's looking at their children and seeing how upward mobile they were when those kids reached 27. In other words, what likelihood were they able to increase their kind of wealth distribution? Were they able to move out of the bottom 25% of employment income? And what they find during this is that when employment among poor parents of children in a community improves, those children are better off economically as adults. You might think, like, obviously, if you're born to parents with jobs, you're going to do better than parents without jobs. But there's a very important distinction here, and this is that community. Specifically, it's not whether a child's own parents are employed, but their community. So that's to say, if you grew up in a community that had 10% unemployment versus one that had 5% unemployment, even if your parents were employed in both of those communities, you would have less upward mobility in the community with 10% versus the 5%. And that's a very important distinction that we're going to come to back, kind of at the conclusion of this when we talk about this kind of ray of sunshine in terms of possibly being able to bring both sides of this together. Now, when this is going to start to get political, we're going to have to talk about race. So everybody's going to have to put on their big girl and big boy pants and try not to get offended. Because the real interesting part of the data and how that, when you see how this data could be weaponized, if not fully represented, comes to when you start looking at it with the difference between low-income whites and low-income blacks. Low-income whites during this, they're excluding Hispanic. So this is saying that these children born between 1978 and 1992, who have now reached the age of 27, what is the income gap between them and someone born to a kind of high income family, not the bottom 25%. And we see that the gap is getting bigger. So this is all inflation adjusted to today's prices. But we see that the gap has gone from 10,000 a year to 13,000 a year. That's almost a 30% increase in the gap. Now, this is not surprising if you understand kind of wealth inequality and things and kind of the general trends in the world. But, the right political right is often making the argument that the opportunities for low-income whites are getting worse in America. And that is the case. We have good data to support that. And when you look at this from low-income blacks, it's actually the opposite. Now, they don't have a chart, but they do have the statistics right here. This got 38% more than their 1978 counterpart. So this graph would effectively look the exact opposite for low-income blacks, where their upward mobility, the gap between them and high earners, is actually getting better. You can imagine how politically charged that data would be, but we have to put a second bit of data in order to understand that really, which is now this is the income gap between those low-income children who have now grown up between black and white. And we see that even though the opportunity for whites is getting worse and the opportunity for blacks is getting better, whites are still about 9,000 income higher than their low-income black counterparts, right? So you can understand the position of both sides, where the right is saying the opportunity for low-income whites is getting worse, and the left might be saying, yes, but minorities are still doing substantially worse than you. And in my opinion on which one of those is right doesn't matter, because I am certainly sympathetic to those that we are going to and saying, look, we understand your situation is getting worse, but you're effectively not poor enough for us to do something about it yet. I can understand that they are not going to get on board with your position, right? And how easy this data would be to weaponize against the other side if you did not accurately represent it, which we're going to get to in a minute. Because the most important thing to take, there's two important things. One of the most important things to take out of this data is that it is not a zero-sum game, meaning upward white mobility is not getting worse at the expense of upward black mobility. In fact, the opposite is the case. Places where opportunity for black children improved most were also where white children did the best. And it comes back to this distinction about employment rates of the community and not the specific parents of the child. And that's where this data comes in. So this is going to take a little bit to parse, but the pink dots are white, the green dots are blue, and we see that the general trend is always like this. So this chart is high mobility, meaning these people have the most chance of kind of escaping their economic class, and then low mobility. And then this is where employment rates fell or rose. And you can see that the trend is the same whether they're black or white, and it's just that during this time period, you have to understand the time period 1978 to 1992, employment rates were falling the most for whites because of where they were living, the Rust Belt, Appalachia, things like that, versus blacks. In fact, during this time period, this was not a great economic time period. There was not a lot of places where employment rates were rising. So it's a really, employment rates are falling all over the country during this time period. Who's faring worse? And whites just happen to be living in places where it's substantial. So the data really supports that this is not a one group at the expense of the other group. Okay, so the second important takeaway is that the work doesn't show that employment is the deciding factor. So this is not saying the most important thing for these children to have upward mobility is the employment rate of where they came from. It is just one factor, and they point to other things like changes in marriage, mortality rates, crime, all sorts of other things. But a lot of these things are really subjective, like marriage, crime. These are like reported differently all over the country, and crime is dealt with, and it's just very, very subjective. But employment rates, which they make the point right down here, even though they may not be the deciding factor, they have the advantage of being well measured and timely, providing an early warning signal of where children might be at risk. Down to the town, county, state, US, national level, we understand employment rates very, very well. And it's usually very timely. At the latest, it's a quarter old on employment rates. And thus, if we had programs or funds that we wanted to try and understand where can we help those living in poverty, specifically to allow their kids some upward mobility, the American dream, right? The upward mobility is such an important part of the American identity. And thus it's so important that we protect it. And the places that we should be targeting are places where the employment rate is dropping, or the communities are struggling to stay employed. And that's where we should be spending our time. And that has nothing to do with race, right? This can be entirely race agnostic. And that's something that both sides should be able to come to agree on and say, look, we have good data about where we should be helping people get out of poverty. Now, if you really like these ideas of kind of like how politics and current economics intersect and why that's creating such division, then this is the mother of all issues. There is a ton of great information of stuff that's going on all over the world and why it's shaping politics these days. Otherwise, stick around the channel for similar content, and I will talk to you soon.